can't shut down a peer-to-peer network, because when you try to shut down a peer-to-peer network, it's kind of like this whack-a-mole where you can spend a lot of time to shut down one node.
Hello, everybody. Today I have the honor of bringing on Mathias, who's the CEO of Holepunch. They develop a ton of different peer-to-peer technologies, P2P. Many of you know this. It's essentially the concept of you connecting to other people. He explains the principles of P2P, benefits for people like you, and the importance of privacy and security in light of everything happening in the world. Mathias also shares a little bit about himself, challenges of building peer-to-peer messengers, and the role of open source in fostering innovation. Without further ado, let's dive into the interview. Hello, Mathias. Welcome to the Techlore Talks podcast. I'd love if you just said a few things about yourself to get started.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me. Of course. So I'm Mathias. I'm the CEO at Holepunch, which is a peer-to-peer company. We work on exclusively peer-to-peer technology. And if anybody who has ever heard me before know that I like to say the word peer-to-peer. I've been working with peer-to-peer my entire career and throughout my open source career. And I'm very, very big believer in changing the status quo and how we distribute and share data and build systems online. So I'm really, really excited to be here and get to talk about this kind of stuff a lot.
Yeah, and then I want to talk a little bit more about your history in a second. But if somebody's new here and they want to learn, they've never heard of peer-to-peer before, do you mind breaking down peer-to-peer very simply for them, as well as how that compares to maybe a traditional technology that most people interact with?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting, right? Because it's what is two words and a number. So and those two words are the same. So peer-to-peer. Actually, I'm Danish, and we actually had a discussion recently what the translation of peer is, which is a really interesting question, I think, in general, because it's a word that has a bunch of different connotations. But basically, it's systems and apps where there's no servers. So you don't have any like infrastructure anywhere or running somewhere else. It's just devices, and you use the devices to build networks. That's the peer. So everybody is kind of like the same in a network and have the same kind of capability as everybody else. And you then solve through technology the problems that arise from that, like security, authenticity, and stuff like that. But by doing that with technology, you end up building these really, really resilient and powerful networks that are also very, very cost efficient, because you just have the devices and scale very naturally. And it's also one of those things where you can hear when I talk about it, I'm a technical person. I love talking about tech. It sounds a little bit technical, but then a lot of people are actually exposed to peer-to-peer a lot. In the past, probably through things like BitTorrent, if they ever tried that. That was very, very big in the early 2000s, which was a peer-to-peer network to distribute media. Still is, but was very big back then. And also there's been like a various apps that's been using peer-to-peer over time to do different things, like multiplayer games back in the day used to do it a lot, and things like that. And so it's technology. Basically, we build networks where everybody has the same capabilities, our peers, yes, it's super cool, and it's a really, really powerful thing.
Yeah, and what's the core benefit if somebody's listening to this and they just use regular technology? They don't think they're using peer-to-peer, even though they probably are at some point or another. And maybe you can touch on some of those scenarios. But what is the real benefit there for a regular person?
It's almost like when you use existing apps online, especially today, like what's the real disadvantages of those apps? There's always these things they don't tell you, because when you use existing apps, there's a lot of infrastructure behind the scenes, especially that has to be paid. When you're using apps where you upload images or things like that, who's paying for that? Who's storing it? What's the incentive for those guys making that app for you outside you just using it? When you're using it for free, people always say, it's because you're the product. People are trying to like data mine you to make ads and stuff like that and read your data. So the real benefit is that in peer-to-peer networks, you don't have that, because you don't have any like behind the scenes actor, other than obviously there's a developer making an app, but like there's no infrastructure. It's just these self-regulating networks. So there's basically nothing hidden in that way. It's just natural networks that solve things. So you can actually have a much more private and forever free experience. So again, if you look at something like BitTorrent, which I'm sure somebody has heard about before, that was a network when it was at the biggest. I don't know how big it is now, but was at the biggest, had like 30, 40 million nodes in the network, like a peer-to-peer network that was massive. Like imagine 40 million computers connected in a network. That's like an insane amount. That's probably bigger than like the biggest data center out there, right? Everybody's sharing, giving a little bit of capacity to that network, which means that the total capacity is really, really big. And that's why these networks can keep existing and keep serving you. And it gives you this benefit of like basically like, you know, there's no, like I said, no hidden stuff. So like nobody's like doing surveillance behind the scenes or trying to data mine your data. Your data is true. You can kind of like make up your own rules. At my company, we make a chat app. Peer-to-peer is really good for that, because then we can have like these unregulated conversations between each other, where it's just between us and nobody else, and not having to worry about things like, you know, people, you know, that feeling when you're, you know, writing messages on WhatsApp and you're talking about fridges, and all of a sudden you get ads from fridges and stuff like that. You don't need to worry about that in peer-to-peer networks, because it's just actually truly private and stuff like that. So it's a really, really powerful thing, and it's also been around for a while. And but also it can be a little bit technical, I guess, which is why a lot of people can be a little bit confused by it.
When did you get started with peer-to-peer technologies, and how did that lead to where you guys are today?
I tell the story a lot, which is like one of those very true stories that just affected my life a lot. But I started programming. So I'm a programmer now, and I started programming in my like career, I guess, relatively late. I only started when I was in at university, because we had to do like mandatory programming. I was studying math, and they didn't want us to come out and be unemployed afterwards. So they were like, you need to do some some real things also. And as part of that, I had to take a course in computer science. And that was very, very interesting to me, because it unlocked this thing inside me that I think is very, very excited about computers in general, which is kind of like this extension of yourself as a person who wants to do things in your career, like, or entrepreneurship. All of a sudden you have a computer, and now you can produce much more, and you can make things open source, and you can put them online, and you have this like just real sense of the power of one. And that was really, really exciting for me as a young person, that you can kind of like just be like, oh, the faster I work, the faster I can build things, and the more impact I can do in the world. I don't need anybody else. I just have everything that I need. And that kind of, I stopped feeling that a little bit when I learned about like networking and deployment, because all of a sudden you had all these things where, sure, it was just me and my computer, but I had all this other stuff also going on, where I had to, you know, buy servers or rent servers back then, and get my credit card out, and kind of like stifled my development here. And like, you would make services online. I used to do that, made a couple of startups, and as they gain traction, they get more expensive to run, and then you would need to upfront think about business models to kind of like cover that cost, and just turn into like a whole different like creative system. I think that was interesting. So as part of that, I started dabbling a little bit more with peer-to-peer, because I was, again, back then BitTorrent was really, really popular, so everybody knew about that, and I started reading about how that worked, and I actually just, as a programmer, started re-implementing a BitTorrent client, which was really fun. It actually unlocked that sense again in me, where like, oh, now I have this network, I made this software, and I can just distribute the software to people, and they can just run it, and we're all part of this bigger network, but like nobody's really running it. So it's kind of like this: every time I write a piece of code, that kind of like unlocks more potential and more potential and more potential. And if it goes viral tomorrow, it's fine. It's going to scale really well. If somebody tries to shut it down because they don't like it, they're going to have a really hard time. So that also unlocks this power in you. So I basically like unlocked that basically in a weekend, that feeling. And I didn't stop, because I was like, wow, this is it. This is how things should be built, because this is just so powerful as an individual, especially, that I just been working on it ever since. This is now 10, 15 years ago, right? And I'm still dabbling it down. And obviously there's like a lot of things in between there and now, but that's the main thing. So I think it's really, really powerful for anybody who's interested in technology and like open source movements and things like that.
Yeah, so you've brought up BitTorrent a lot, and I think the regular person, if they hear BitTorrent, especially if they've never used it before, kind of the common associations is it's illegal, it's not good, and also it's unregulated. I think people actually enjoy some of the perceived safety of having a company that they can trust to handle their data. So do you mind commenting on a bit of that association with peer-to-peer tech, as well as, is it actually, like, what's stopping someone from joining this network and doing something malicious on the network?
That's also, I think that's some really good points in general. I think, so, you know, so like I said, BitTorrent, I said BitTorrent a lot because I grew up with that, and it was very big back then, and also like a big technical inspiration. But BitTorrent was like a network where you made a peer-to-peer system that could be used to share media. And in the early 2000s, like for 10 years around that time, before these big streaming services we have today, this was a very popular way of sharing content. And obviously a lot of that content, I think, you know, had copyright issues and stuff like that. There was a lot of people got in a lot of trouble for that back then. But one thing it really showed was that you can make technology where if there's a demand in the market. So back then there was no like other way of, if you're in like a small country like in Denmark or in many places in Europe or even I'm sure in the US places, there was actually just really hard to get a lot of content, even if you wanted to pay for it. So there was a real market for like digital.
That's still an issue nowadays. You know,
yeah.
Adobe, if you bought the lifetime license to an old Adobe product, they still remove the download links from their website. So the only way to download that software is via things like BitTorrent. Yeah, just side note. Don't mean to interrupt.
So it's technically never-ending license, but you can't get it. That's great. That's classic.
Yeah.
So yeah, and also like I moved recently to Switzerland from Denmark, and also here it's also a small country, and then they limit what kind of like translations you can get and like subtitles because they think everybody speaks Italian in my region and stuff like that. So I don't know. It's like there's a lot of really really weird choices in content distribution in general. We can talk a lot about. But basically, like back then, there was even harder, and there's a real demand in the market, right? And the thing that stepped up to fill that demand because companies weren't doing it, probably does a lot of reasons, were self-made products like BitTorrent. So, products where you could just share these things. Obviously, there was a lot of legal issues with that. And they got very, very big. And the media industry got extremely scared because they're like, oh, they only saw the negative part of that, which, I can to some degree understand, like you're just seeing a lot of content being distributed for free. Fair enough, that's very scary. They could see their livelihood going away, right? So they tried really, really hard back then to shut it down, the network. And they realized over time that you can't shut down a peer-to-peer network. So they've went on different strategies. Because when you try to shut down a peer-to-peer network, it's kind of like this whack-a-mole where you can spend a lot of time to shut down one node, but then another node pops up and you shut down, and then like two other nodes pop up, and it's basically impossible. Just when you hear those numbers, like 20, 30, 40 million nodes and everything is a process, like it's basically impossible. The reason why BitTorrent then went down a little bit since then is because we got other alternatives today, like Netflix and things like that, to kind of like help solve that demand in the market. And now they have a lot of the same issues like we just discussed, like with fragmentation and like content not being available and being removed and stuff like that. So I'm sure it's going to go like this. But from a technical point of view, like peer-to-peer was the way to show that we can just do this without waiting for people. We can just do this with networks where we don't have to bear like insane amount of content costs to distribute things. Like there's no like one person who pays the bill and stuff. So really, really interesting, really, really powerful. Obviously, with this kind of like unregulation, like you said, there's also interesting things that happens because you can just share whatever you want, right? This was like in the Wild West period of the internet, so there's also like a lot of people who just got bad copies of movies and stuff like that, I'm sure, and things like that. So definitely there's definitely like not just a technological solution to something. You still need to think about these other things also in these networks. But as with anything technology, you can always build something crazy and scary and bad, but you can also use the same technology to build powerful, simple apps that try to solve these things still, because like there's no reason why the technology can't be used for both. And that's actually one of the things that I've been involved with my entire career. It's kind of like saying, what if we took the ideas that were so powerful in BitTorrent, but then try to not couple it too much to just kind of like to file sharing, but just kind of like say, these principles are clearly extremely powerful. How can we take these and make any kind of apps, any kind of content, run with these ideas without just having to like disregard all the other things we know that are very needed for like app development, like you said, like easy understanding of content. Like you don't want to search and have 50 versions of the same thing. You want to have some sort of ideas there. Some things do need some regulation if the app developers want, like, kind of like in our chat app, we have a way for people to be moderators in chat rooms and stuff like that. So you can make up your own rules, but like anybody can kind of like set up their own rules and stuff like that. But like kind of like still running on the principles of peer-to-peer, so you can make these things, make them powerful and make them unstoppable.
Nice. And yeah, I definitely want to touch on the Messenger and the other stuff that you guys are working on in a sec. But you've been bringing up some interesting stuff that I want to ask a little bit more about. So you mentioned the concept of not being able to easily shut it down. So can you comment a bit on censorship resistance of just P2P technologies in general?
Yeah, sure. So it's basically like, I'm sure there's some eloquent principle in this that I will find after this podcast and start quoting a lot. But it's this idea that, everybody's the same, right? So it's kind of like this crowd mentality that's been working for humans for generations. Once you get to a critical mass of a movement, you can't shut down a movement because you can't like lock up everybody, basically, right? If you're being dramatic. So peer-to-peer really works in big networks because you everybody's the same. There's literally no difference between nodes in the network when a peer-to-peer system is built correctly. Sure, some networks will be a little bit fatter, has more content than others, but the idea is the same, right? So it's completely unrealistic for once, just like by the law of numbers, once the networks get going, it becomes completely impossible to shut down. And again, if you look at like stuff like BitTorrent, because it's just such a good case story, and actually, I'm surprised that not more has been written about just like the implications of these networks, not so much in tech, but also just kind of like human behavior in these networks, because I think it's very, very interesting. It's very interesting how also those networks from people who wanted to shut them down, that battle was fought, because in the end, the thing that there was some success with, I think, in BitTorrent in terms of like limiting these networks was trying to attack the few centralized point of views on that. And I think that's actually very hard for normal people, like non-technical people, to understand. So like in a network like BitTorrent, right, people were trying to find torrent files back then through websites, and they would go to a website, they would find content there. And the way, in the end, that this war was also fought was like trying to shut down those websites. A lot of times very successfully. There's a lot of good documentaries around that with the Pirate Bay and things like that. By getting the websites delisted. And how were they getting delisted? By just attacking the centralized part of the internet, which is the DNS registry, like the thing that translates your name to a website. Because there you could just go with like a normal process and be like, I don't want this website listed anymore. Here's a bunch of legal reasons why not. And then some legal process would say, yeah, that's correct. This is legally not okay or whatever, etc. And then users would go to that website and the browser would say, no, that doesn't exist anymore. So the network will still be running in the background, and people who knew how to still get access to like listings of content will still work. But like by attacking these things, the one piece of this network that was centralized, it was pretty effective on that part, I think. Also a bunch of learnings there, kind of like how just one piece of centralization kind of like tends to unravel you from a user's point of view, and how it can get very hard to understand from users really fast. So again, like really, really interesting use cases here, and like things to learn also from a resilience point of view.
Yeah, and then the last question before we touch a little bit more on what you guys are doing, you mentioned the concept of bad movies. This is something I've had to share as well. It's not an issue exclusive to peer-to-peer tech, but I feel like it is a little bit more of a Wild West, and it's maybe a little bit more likely for someone to download something that's malicious if they're not careful. So how does someone assess safety if something's peer-to-peer? Not just from making sure they download the correct thing, but I don't know if this is technically peer-to-peer. Jack Dorsey released his Messenger, which I believe uses a mesh network, but I don't know if that's technically peer-to-peer. But either way, when it was first launched, it's gotten much better since then. It had tons of vulnerabilities. It wasn't even using proper encryption. They themselves even came forward and said you shouldn't be trusting this with anything sensitive. But something being peer-to-peer isn't alone any kind of metric of safety. So how can someone still assess safety when they're kind of responsible for their own safety on a peer-to-peer network?
Yeah, for sure. I think actually an easier way to think about that is kind of like saying there's like the technological aspect of it, which is kind of like you have some content in a network and I want to access that content. Can we do that securely? And if we have like no bugs in the software and we've done this for a while, that's actually that's the problem we've been solving for a long time, and it's a surmountable problem and very boring in some degree. But then the much more interesting question also becomes, also from a UX point of view, is kind of like, well, I can get a virus from you or like some bad piece of software, and I can get that cryptographically verified, and it can be super secure to get it, but it's still a virus. So it's kind of like it doesn't really help me that the network is trying to make this really good. And what's the solution to that? Well, the solution to that is obviously there's a technological aspect of it, but it's also much like a product design thing, and like how do we think about these things in products? So I think if we think about the content way, it's really good, right? Because it's like in a content app where you're sharing something that to some degree has a known origin, let's call that. So like, let's say we were building like the Netflix of peer-to-peer, and we're not trying to be pirates. We have the rights, and we just want to do this way because it's like distribution-wise, like much stronger model than putting it all on a server. Then you can still make systems in a peer-to-peer network where you add like a stamp of approval to content. So you can have like an index being served, like a search engine being served that is coming back to me, that's saying, yeah, I approve of this index. So this is Mathias's index. This is what I say things should map to. So if you search for this thing, you can get some trust that if you trust me, you're not getting the content from me, but you're getting an idea what the correct content is. So you're getting like, that direction to get to your content. And we see this all the time in like existing apps and social networks. So like even in things like, if you think about recommendations, it's almost the same thing, right? If if you and I have, I can't remember, there's this very popular recommendation app for movies that I can't remember the name of right now, where you will search for things and it will say, oh, your friend likes this one, so you should probably watch it, and then you can go and find it on Netflix or whatever. It's kind of like the same thing. This idea that people in your social group or even people you trust elsewhere can give content these stamps of approval, and then in the peer-to-peer networks, you can just expand a little bit more and say, well, it's not just about approval of like, is this a good movie or not? It's also like, this is the right thing and this is the thing you should be looking for. The cool thing about it is that actually it's a really cheap thing to do in terms of like network effects and technical complexity, because you're not really, that doesn't have to be tied together with the fact that I have all the rights for all the content. It just says that if these rights are distributed correctly, and that's obviously a thing, I will approve that this stamp of this file is correct, and then you can build some very strong networks like that. And that's really, really powerful when used correctly, because like social proof and like even extending that also to third-party validators is really, really powerful. And it's all over us in modern society. And I think we tend to forget that in general. Like it's kind of like, back in the day when you could go to Blockbuster and buy a movie. That's how old I am. That's how I got my content in the early 2000s. You would also trust that the movie that Blockbuster has is the correct movie. Why? Because it's a big brand, and you would trust that they're not switching the discs with something else. The same idea here that would just translate into like a network where you say, I can have the digital version of that, but I can still have the content being distributed like peer-to-peer afterwards. That's really, really powerful.
Pivoting over to what you guys are doing. So I've tried the messenger, Keet, I believe, K-E-E-T. Do you mind covering, I guess the first question I'm sure a lot of people are going to ask is, why another messenger? So if you want to expand on like what you guys are doing that differentiates yourself and kind of how it's going so far.
Yeah, for sure. So like I said, I've been working with peer-to-peer my entire career, and like I'm very, very invested in it. And around like four years ago, we decided to get really, really serious about peer-to-peer from a not just technical point of view, but also kind of like adoption. How can we get this ball rolling and get this technology out to everybody and try to disrupt the industry, both from a software development point of view, but also like a product point of view, because like we already discussed, like peer-to-peer has been around cycles before, but been kind of tied to these use cases like piracy and things like that in the past. But like expand that and not just do that, but like, or like not do it at all, but like build like real apps that do it. And so we founded our company Holepunch back then, and we're like, let's set a goal to make the hardest possible app that kind of like encompasses everything in terms of like what an app should do, so we can both just solve a real use case and also like validate that this thing works technically in every case. And we very quickly, after like a brainstorm, decided like a messenger app is actually one of those apps that is incredibly simple. Like a messenger app is like you just type. But once you start going through the requirements you want from a messenger app, you quickly realize that it has all the requirements of every piece of software ever, right? It's kind of like you and I want to be able to chat, but we also want to be able to chat securely without surveillance and like in a private way. I want to be able to have a private chat with you and just send you what I actually think without thinking that if somebody reads this, that's not us, that this, has consequences. Messengers also have file sharing, obviously, right? Because, we send content all the time. It's a very natural way to send content. Whenever I send movies and stuff like that, is always to my parents of my kid and media and stuff like that. And that also ties into like, it should be private, it should be secure, because I don't want that stuff to go anywhere else because it's private stuff. But it also has this like scalability aspect of it. Of if I wanted to share that for some reason with a very, very big chat group, like with thousands and thousands of people, it should still work and still be scalable. Check on that one. It's like a really hard one and very, very important. And then also we've been seeing in the last, even before that, but especially in the last 5 years, just the world turned to a much, much darker place in terms of like the digital rights we have in these kind of apps. Like there's more and more stuff going on where both from like a data mining point of view, trying to like read our internal thoughts behind the scenes so we can get better advertisement and stuff like that and sell more products. But also just from a, for lack of a better word, control point of view, like, having an idea of backdoors and surveillance, even in like pretty liberal places, traditionally liberal places like Europe. Recently, it's been turning very, very dark on that. So very quickly, we identified this as like, oh, this is something we need to solve. And we decided to build a chat app. And it's been really, really exciting to build that out ever since, and like tackling all these problems up front and get it to scale and get it to run and like get it to run on devices. And again, like without any infrastructure, just devices So like no hidden, server gets backed up to or anything like that. Just devices that can talk directly to each other. And then with a big UX caveat on top that the users should never really be aware of this. Like it should just work like any other app. We don't want it to be like a technical niche app. We want it to be like a everyday user app that just solves this from a user's point of view. So that's Keet, and we just shipped our latest version of it just before this podcast. Actually, so we're shipping like crazy. It's been really fun, and it's still really fun, and it's getting really good and really powerful. So when you make a peer-to-peer app, you don't really know about scale and stuff because, again, like there's not a server I can log into and be like, how many users are online right now and what's the scale? Because it's like just devices talking to each other. So it's kind of like you hear it through the grapevine. You hear like, oh, this is happening and this is happening, and you try to like figure out what's happening to get a sense of like, is this going well? Is this going bad? What's working? What isn't? It's very, very social. You have to talk to people. But we recently had a big like onboarding of new users due to links being shared in Eastern Europe, and it was really fun to see the app grow a lot and like the network grow with that and stuff like that. So it's been very exciting.
Yeah, my assumption is you can probably see analytics from App Store and Google Play Store downloads, and maybe on your site, and that's about it.
And then we have a few public rooms in Keet that we have a link to that you can click on if you want to join, and we get a sense of both community in that, but also it's also been a very big learning that when you have a big room on a big network, just bringing the whole world into a single room can be very intense for sure, just with like different cultures and stuff.
And everything's open source, correct?
So our entire stack is open source. Our Keet frontend is closed right now, but our like 99% of our engine is available on GitHub. And if you're interested in peer-to-peer development in general, you should go check it out. It's really a beast of an engine these days, with all kinds of stuff. Because like I said, we've been having to solve just so many things that you don't think about. Also, when you start getting devices to sync, having the same state, getting files, getting big files to work, getting push notifications to work in a peer-to-peer environment is really hard on devices, getting them to run in the background, all this stuff. So if you have like a weekend where you're not doing anything, I would definitely start around GitHub and end at the other end of it.
Here, I've quite a few questions to ask that came up. The first one is, can you explain the concept of something being serverless? Because even somebody who, I think there's this dangerous middle ground that a lot of people have fallen in, where they might know what a server is as a concept. They know it's maybe like the company has this thing, I'm talking to the company, and then the company sends message to someone else. But the concept of cutting that out and you directly talking to somebody else is a bit different for people. So do you mind explaining how that works in something like Keet or just in general?
Yeah, for sure. And also, it's even more confusing because I'm sure if you Google serverless, there was a term that was very popular like 4 years ago about using servers for other things. So it's a confusing space. But basically, serverless now context here just means run things without servers. What does that mean? It means that we have a bunch of consumer devices these days. I have a phone. I'm sure you have a phone. Everybody has a phone. I have a smartwatch. Some people have that also. I have a laptop. Some people have that also. And all of a sudden, us as consumers have accumulated a bunch of devices that over the last 20 years, 30 years have become incredibly powerful compared to what they used to be. So, like my laptop and your phone has, I don't even know how many magnitudes more power than we used to go to the moon in the 60s, right? It's like, one of those ridiculously incredible numbers that just baffles the mind. So we just have a lot of compute power very close to us all the time. And we seldomly use it because, how often outside being very active on your phone spends most of the time being in your pocket, or your desktop also be like idles most of the time. And they're also much more powerful than, it's not like when you use your phone that is like just running at 100% power 24/7. So they have a lot of space and stuff, and they're only getting better. So we have a lot of devices, but still as software developers and like people who think about products, we kind of still in this mental model of like, we don't from back in the day, but we should, instead of like using more compute on devices, we have external servers like data centers that does all the compute. And then, when you and I in traditional apps would send data to each other, we would say, well, first of all, let's get it to that big server and then have the server do it and then have the server send it back to us later. So when we have no internet, things stop working, or if we get blocked or banned, or that the data center catches fire, things stop working. It creates these absurd situations a lot of time where, I have an office here And when me and my co-founder sits in the office here, I sit at this table, he sits at a table like 2 meters next to me. And when we use Slack and I send a message, if you just think about the travel of that message, it's like one of those like big adventures in life where that message will go, even though there's only 2 meters to him, will go from like my laptop to some data center somewhere, be backed up in like maybe another data center and like on some servers. And it's probably not even, it's like probably crossed like 3 or 4 countries by this stage, only to be dropped down on the other side of the computer, on the other side of the table, and then with a ton of still processing power, when in fact we could just take the direct line, which is just my device to his device. So that's basically what peer-to-peer is trying to do. So it's also kind of interesting because it's how computing used to work. If you go back and think about original computing, this idea of a server is kind of like made up, right? Because a server is just another computer. Everything is just computers. So peer-to-peer is just good old-fashioned, cut out the middleman, just do things directly. And then the only other thing that's a little bit sophisticated is that obviously as you add like 3, 4, 5, 6 computers, you don't want to have to talk to all of them. So you need to do a little bit of technology to make that smart. But at the end of the day, that's just technology. So cut out the middleman and make everything fast and simple.
Nice. And then in regards to Keet, I had a few more questions before we touch on other stuff you guys are working on. So you mentioned on the open source side of things, you have the open source stack, but then a closed front end. So why is it structured that way?
Yeah, good question. It's also something we get asked, not a lot, but like obviously technical-minded people have this question a lot. We're trying to make Keet as an app that your parents, you can use, my parents, myself, and anybody can use. Basically trying to take this very sophisticated piece of technology, which peer-to-peer at the end of the day is, behind the scenes, and make it work for real people. That requires also like kind of like going back to the thing we had in the beginning about like how do you get the right movie and stuff. It's the same for like crazy peer-to-peer apps. We need to make an experience that's really simple for people to understand. We need to have an app in the app store that's like always the latest app that's like easy to understand, that has a brand that people can go to as we bootstrap this network, so we don't kind of like get stuck in the small phase with like 1,000 different clones of this app where every one of them is out of date because they all bundled the peer-to-peer app, but not the latest version, and like nothing really works because there's like too much proliferation too fast. So we're thinking a lot about that UX, how to make this like not a nerd technical product, but like kind of like a mainstream product. And that's a big reason why we try to keep the front end closed so we can iterate really fast and have this the experience like everybody's up to date. If you try out Keet, this is the thing that the biggest complaint I get from my in-laws who uses Keet a lot. I talk to them in Ukraine a lot, in which Keet works really well there because the networks are pretty bad. The biggest complaint I get is like every time Keet updates, it tells them to restart and get the latest one. And we update it a lot. We update every 2 weeks. And the reason why we do that is because by doing that in this like bootstrapping phase, because again, all the software you need to access the network is literally on your device. There's no other software somewhere. So like the full stack is on your device, which is kind of incredible to think about. So by keeping everybody up to date in like in a bootstrapping phase and stuff like that makes it so much easier for the product to move fast. And again, go into this mission of like attack the mainstream, change the world. So we're very, very focused on that, and just keeping the front end closed and iteration heavy is really, really big part of that. Now, I've written like so much open source code in my career, like incredible amounts, because that's basically all I did for like 10 years, just produced open source code. And so I like seen every aspect of it, but I'm a big, big believer of it. And that's why we then take like literally that 99% that the rest, so people can review it and contribute to it. We have a lot of really good contributors and help push that part of the stack forward. It's not always the easiest thing to contribute to peer-to-peer because some parts of it can be tricky because it's like cryptography, but we do get a lot of good contributions and stuff. So that's like the short answer. Like long but short answer, I guess, is like we're trying to make something that's truly mainstream, and by doing that, we need to be a little bit aggressive on these things, and that's why we do these things right now.
When someone downloads the app update, is that download done via a server, or is that done P2P?
On the desktops, we have a desktop build and a mobile build. On mobile build, we can do a whole podcast of this. You're a bit more restricted because you're in the ecosystem of the app stores, and the app stores have the stuff that app stores have in terms of like guidelines and rules. So you have to get some stuff from the app store always on update, but we try to do as much as we can update-wise there.
Do you publish an APK on the Android side of things?
we publish an APK on Keet. So we have Keet publishing the APK. So it's like cryptographically verified, comes from us. So we have a chat room that's called the APK room that we maintain, and then implicitly everything is verifiable from there. And that we are all published to Google's Play Store and the iOS one also. And on desktop, we have our peer-to-peer platform also, and that's fully peer-to-peer on the update. So everything on that running peer-to-peer, so like truly mega unstoppable, nobody can take it down kind of situation on desktop. And we'll get there on mobile also. Like we have a big 10-year plan to kind of like disrupt that thing also through various things. But like I think it's really, really important. It's also very frustrating that you're a bit more limited on this side and mobile, because there's no reason. Like we could do it tomorrow if we were allowed to.
Yeah, I tested Keet only on desktop, and it was very clean. And I guess it depends what desktop you're running. If you're running a 24/7 desktop, it makes a lot of sense, especially with something peer-to-peer, because you're always online. You have a reliable network. I think it's kind of the best case scenario. Do you want to speak a little bit about background sync? I assume on iOS that's going to be a big challenge, or if it's not already. When you're your own peer, there's no server, so the device always has to be running in the background, I assume.
So it's actually also equally hard on Android. It's actually funny you say this, because literally 3 hours ago, we rolled out our first big part of background sync on iOS. So
that's exciting. How do you do that? Is that using the new iPad background sync, or is that also on iOS?
So we do a variety of things, because there's not really one solution on iOS, and we also don't run it 24/7 in the background. So just to dial it back a little bit. So a couple of years ago, one of the first big things we did was release this thing in Keet where other people can help you maintain your network. It's called blind peering. So a peer can hold your data fully encrypted, can't see it, but that helps you like in a network where a very small network. Like if you and I had a DM, that's a network of two people, which is the weakest P2P network, because if one of us is offline, 50% of the network is offline. And like most of the time when you and I text each other, there's usually a device offline, a very high chance of a device offline. So you want to have a system where a very, very small network can introduce a third peer, obviously that's like fully private, and just hold your data for a little bit. And then, I come online, we can get it from there. So we did that a couple of years ago. It's really, really good for small networks. It's kind of ironic. I say this a lot, but like in peer-to-peer, the hardest problems is the small problems. So like in a centralized network, that problem is really easy, because it's like, oh, you have a server, it has tons of capacity. So like two people, it's like tons of capacity. But then as that grows in a centralized network, that gets harder and harder and harder, because the capacity runs out. In a peer-to-peer network, like if you're only two people, that's tricky. But then you had 3 people, now it's a lot better. And now you have 4 people, that's a lot better. And all of a sudden, when you're 10 people, all problems goes away. So it's like you want to have more capacity. So we have that in there, and it helps a lot with these kind of like situations where you can pick somebody else from the network and help that hold a bit. And that's basically how small chats work. Then obviously you want to have as much backgrounding as possible, because it just helps the entire network also. On iOS, they have this general backgrounding API that can run once in a while, but also every time you get a notification, you can run a little bit of backgrounding on iOS, and things like that. And you're also allowed to linger a bit in the background as you use the app. So all that stuff adds up and actually gives you a lot of compute, because we don't need that much. But just kind of like every time we add it, it's kind of like you can imagine the data is on our side, because there's many devices. So every time we add a little bit, the entire thing gets higher. So that works pretty well. But it's obviously a challenge. I actually find it personally really frustrating on phones, because my phone is on all the time anyway, right? It's kind of like I can get a notification at any time. So why? And I bought it. I literally paid lots of money for it. So why can't I, as a developer, do similar things? Because like all the arguments basically come down to we don't want you to, because we could do it in a way, we can do it in a way where it's like as energy efficient as receiving a push notification, because that's basically what it is, and stuff like that. So it's a little bit frustrating, but over time we'll get there on that. But it's not just a technical challenge. And then on Android, we do similar things.
Yeah, I guess what I've seen is apps like even Signal, Briar. If you don't have Google Play services on Android, they have this like always running 24/7. It drains up quite a bit of battery approach, because there isn't really an easy alternative. I know Unified Push has been kind of getting a little bit more popular, but it seems like people don't really like the complexity of that either for end users.
You really need a thing where you can hook into the systems, a low-level chip that says the network is running now and then run a little bit. That's a very good system, and they should just allow us to do that.
So pivoting over to other things. So you guys are Holepunch, and I'll ask about your team and a little bit more about you guys. But what are some of the other things that you're working on?
So we have quite a big team now. Like I said, we've been going on for like 4 years. Also, we're hiring developers. So if anybody's listening here is into programming, you should definitely go check it out. There's a lot of really fun and hard challenges to work with. But Holepunch is a collaboration between Tether and us in terms of like trying to like do this big push to disrupt the status quo. If you don't know, Tether is this world's biggest stablecoin, which is kind of like digital dollars to send things back and forth, which is really, really cool and fits really well with like a peer-to-peer things. So we're trying basically through that also to disrupt the entire industry of both how you share data, and Tether does it on the financial side and stuff like that. And overlapping those things are very exciting. But we recently did a big push of other apps also to try to push the technology and just there's so many things to solve on these things. That's really exciting. So right now we're also working on something in a collaboration with them called PairPass, which is a password manager app, because that also I think fits the bill really well on these like simple but very powerful use cases of like, how can you take something that's like extremely close to us right now? A lot of things still require passwords and like secure nodes and stuff like that, and keep it truly private and truly secure without having to rely on any kind of centralization. So we did a big push on that recently, trying to like just take the stack, like 90% of the stack that's also running Keet, again, all open source. PairPass is fully open source, to kind of like show people also how to build things completely from the ground up, because it doesn't have that big mainstream thing I said in the earlier, like it's kind of like, it's more a normal thing. Hopefully you're not going to send many chat messages in a password app. That would be kind of crazy. So that's rolling out really soon. Super excited to get that one out. I've been playing around with it a lot myself. I helped coordinate a bit of the code initially, but the team has really been cranking away on that. It's just really powerful and really simple at the end of the day. So super cool stuff.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask about that because password managers are an interesting one. I get a lot of people who leave comments and are concerned about the idea of a server holding their passwords, even though, we can verifiably prove that it's encrypted, and it's theoretically no different than if you were to encrypt it yourself and upload it on a server. And then I think the whole peer-to-peer aspect could be a bit scary for someone. But before I get to that, I just wanted to quickly ask about the stack. It sounds like the stack that you use for Keet can be repurposed to be used for many other things. So what exactly is the stack? Really just the ability for you as a device to be a peer to connect to other peers and transmit data, and then the actual data and the UX is kind of the only difference between any potential products?
So, like I said in the beginning, we tried to this big mission of like, let's basically disrupt software development, how you make apps and stuff like that. And so we quickly just put that into different categories. Like, what do you need when you make an app? You need like a database. You need some sort of connectivity, as in like, kind of like right now we're recording a podcast. We have a stream together where we can see each other, like a call. So you need some sort of real-time communication. You need persistence databases. You need some sort of file sharing if you're doing stuff like that, or at least components for that. And the various other small and bigger components for that. And we made just software modules for each of them that kind of like, for a software developer, has some normal looking interfaces that makes it relatively familiar to make apps, and then package that up into a bunch of small modules so you can kind of like pick and choose what you want, and then make that freely available for any kind of app that wants to be peer-to-peer. Like I said, that's all there, open source, available on GitHub. We have a website. That's the only website we have outside Keet.io, called pairs.com, where we have a little documentation on how to work with this and like make examples and stuff like that.
So theoretically, I can download that stack, develop my own messenger using the same stack. Would that be its own network, or would that actually still be part of the same network that everyone's using for something like Keet?
It would be its own network, because every app is its own network. Like, we could then make a collaboration and like try to bridge those networks if we wanted to. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. But like peer-to-peer, I think it's good you bring that up, because it can be a little bit hard to understand, because peer-to-peer is not like one big network. It basically just means whatever you want. So normally you would just make that kind of like everything is a little network by itself, and have your decisions kind of like encapsulate that. That makes a lot of sense. And also, that's one of the reasons why we can just do this open source and for free, because like it doesn't cost us anything to run it. It's not like when you do that, like there's something we allocate on our end it also means that there's nothing for us where we need to sell you something when you do it. So we can just have it be software. It's not like there's a token or something like that you have to buy and or like can invest in to kind of hope that helps the network. Because again, this is just between you and your devices, how you define it, and you can do whatever you want in a good way. So really simple infrastructural tech. We have this internal, I don't want to say mission because that sounds wrong, but it's kind of like this mantra of saying, if we go bankrupt tomorrow and we shut down the company, everything should still be running. So like everything is kind of like built with that mentality. So it's truly just peer-to-peer. So I don't want to say hosted. I'm trying to come up with a different word because that sounds wrong also, but it's like self-regulating networks, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess one quick question. I know I kind of threw the password manager thing at you, and then we quickly changed subjects. But on the topic of funding and Tether, what let's say Tether decides we don't want to keep doing this anymore. What would happen to Holepunch? So is there a strong dependence there?
So we have a big long-term strategic like partnership that we're like very, very committed to, both of us. When we started doing Holepunch, like I said, we came into this with this idea of like, let's make technology that truly has no infrastructure. So it's a very interesting company because we actually don't have any infrastructure other than, testing stuff here and there. And it's also a very interesting thing to talk about financially. I get asked this a lot on other podcasts, like how do you guys make money and like what's like the profitability on these things and stuff like that, which is very, very good questions. Because right now we've been very focused on the technological side of it. But something that's very interesting on that, and also kind of like to answer your question, is as the products scale and we add people, like I said, we're just onboarding a huge amount of new people that we think, at least to Keet recently, the company costs don't go up. So we have this like idea that we have, we have budgets, we have money in the bank, we can kind of like look ahead and say, well, obviously we need to pay people salaries. That's how the world works. That's good. But like, there's not like hidden, if there's overnight success, what do we need to do to like keep things running and stuff like that? And that's a whole different way of thinking about just both financial roadmaps and like profitability and like and things like that. It's a much more almost like old school way of thinking of things, because we can have this idea that we can make technology that can scale really fast, but at the same time we can have the freedom to never really think about burn rate in that same sense, because the burn rate is very flat, and that makes our life really. My life a lot easier, because I can just look, on the runway and be like, that's it. But also I can, when we make the products, focus on just like pure product development. So like, for example, right now, something we're rolling out in Keet that we just rolled out a very early preview version of, and the latest version of Keet is like big podcast style calls like this one, where you can do like big calls. So normally if I was doing that on a traditional product, I would be like, okay, so you and I are talking here, that's like bandwidth, that's going to cost money. So if we host all of our servers, what if that gets really, really popular? It's going to be a big bill coming in. And Keet, we just do it because we're like, it doesn't matter. Because like, that's just, the network is like paying for that by people just streaming themselves. They've already paid for the internet. So that just changes the equation completely. We're very, very excited in general to partner with Tether, because Tether is like such a beast in terms of like financial capabilities. It's like, I don't know if you follow it closely, but it just grows bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger every month, and that's basically the same kind of mentality we have with peer-to-peer. Like, we want to do something that impacts the world in truly like a irreversible way, and kind of like change the status quo. So I think that's a really, really good synergy there.
Yeah, with video streaming, I know there's still a centralized aspect to it, because like I still have to pay to host the videos on my server. There's still a server. But it reminds me a lot of PeerTube, because when you go and watch a video, you're also streaming some of the bandwidth to someone else, and there's still a peer-to-peer aspect. And I'm going to ask you about kind of the hybrid solutions towards the end. But I want to quickly double-click on the password manager question I kind of threw you away earlier, of the whole idea of potentially sharing password management, even if it's encrypted, information with other peers on a network.
So first of all, I think with password managers, I think my friend told me this analogy once that I think just fits really well. I'm sure he heard it from somebody else, but it's kind of like, even with centralized password managers, if you look at something existing today where you have these apps that is like centralized solution, they all have very, very strong cryptography, I'm sure, and there's a lot of like decent ones out there. But my friend told me this thing that I always think about is kind of like, well, if you have the world's best scientists, right, and they all have to travel somewhere, do you put them all on the same plane? It's kind of like the plane is really safe, right? It never crashes, but like still, would you do it? And it's like, there's always this like slight risk of like, well, maybe something went wrong in the cryptography and things like that. So you want to have options where you can kind of like define your own thing. So in a peer-to-peer password manager like AutoPass, the true power, I think, is kind of like in that aspect of options. So The app itself has various settings you can choose. So you can basically choose, I just want to back this up with myself. It's obviously all super strong, mega encrypted at rest and in flight and all this stuff that I'm sure also existing password managers have. That would then go to one centralized place. Our AutoPass doesn't. So you can choose there, like I just want to have it between my own devices, and then if I lose all my devices, tough luck, my passwords are gone. That's a feature. Or I want to have it be backed up to my friends through their, social backups. I'm sure we're missing a little bit of UX on that. Or I want to have it be in this like general blind peer networks where people can kind of like, anybody can help or choose these specific ones. And I think we have a lot of options in the app. I can't remember exactly what the final one looked like, but like where you can like pick very specifically where things go and stuff like that. Because one of the powers of peer-to-peer is this idea that it doesn't really matter where things come from. So that makes it very, very easy to build these things out without having to think so much about it.
Got it. So you're saying if I have 3 devices, let's say a desktop, a laptop, and a phone, and they, let's say I'm coming from KeePass, so I'm used to an offline experience. Can I just have an offline database that I can just manually, if I want, copy and paste essentially onto another device? I guess that's question 1. And then question 2 is, it sounds like I can just have a sync chain that's peer-to-peer across just those 3 devices. It doesn't touch any other device. And then I can also extend it to other people and beyond if I want to.
Exactly. So and I think I called it AutoPass before. That's because our module is called AutoPass. The app itself is called PairPass, but which is it rolls very well over on the tongue, PairPass. But exactly that. So you can kind of like you can build your own topology. Everything in PairPass is fully open source also. So you can even just also go in if you wanted to change something in that. You can go in and edit it, and the network will still work because the protocol itself, just peer-to-peer, is simple and super strong. So very powerful. We used this opportunity when we were making this to have it be audited by other people. So we got a security audit on it also that we'll be publishing with the app and stuff like that. That has been a good experience for us just to try to think through these questions that you say. Also, how can we make this feel comfortable to everybody and make it powerful? It's really interesting to think about it that way because like even me as somebody who's like again like understand the powers of encryption and stuff like that. I think just having it sync with myself is really powerful. I think that's like a good redundancy factor in how I can be very comfortable with these things also. And the cool thing about a peer-to-peer network is like you can do that while still having the comfort of like a normal syncing system, if you know what I mean. Like I'm a big fan of KeePass, as you mentioned, but it can be a little bit cumbersome with the setups because it's like that's basically
I moved away from it.
Yeah, but
I used to use it, but
it's not to say anything bad with it because it's basically a feature of it. It's just that's why it's so simple and powerful. But it's like you also want to have this like, oh, now I gotta switch my phone and stuff like that. So the combo is needed, I think.
It's actually quite interesting because unless I started using a centralized cloud provider, like if you just do manual syncing on your device using something like Dropbox, the cleanest experience I ever had with KeePass was using SyncThing, which I believe, I know it can work locally on your network, but I believe also has some kind of peer-to-peer aspect, if I'm not mistaken. And so you're essentially just making that all in one into the same password manager and kind of adding in the P2P side of it directly in there.
Yeah, and I think it's actually it's a really good analogy because basically instead of just saying, hey, let's like have things produce files and then sync them with like some file sharing network, what we're saying also with the peer-to-peer stack is saying, well, let's go a little bit deeper. So like, let's make the infrastructure in the apps do this, right? And then just have developers have the tools to make applications. So if you look at the software for PairPass, you'll notice that it's not really peer-to-peer. It's just kind of like interacting with a database, putting things in and out. And then the software then helps make that peer-to-peer after. So I think why that's really cool is kind of like the same idea you just described there. You just make an app, you make it look pretty, you make it look simple, and have it work locally, and then let the peer-to-peer magic do its magic and have that make it like, multi-device and stuff like that. And that's where it gets really powerful because for me, that just shows you that anybody can do this and you don't have to have a PhD in networking or anything like that to make these kind of like very powerful distributed systems. So that's where I'm like, outside just having a really good password manager, which is really needed, I'm just personally very, very excited.
Yeah, and I like that as well because I know I had this issue as well in SyncThing where sometimes something wouldn't sync fully and then I had something that would be corrupted or it didn't sync the latest version. And so I feel like having everything being run in a similar environment would actually make a lot of sense.
I'm sure also, just to finish on that thought, because I'm sure also in an environment like that, if you had, in something like a password manager where I have passwords to share with my wife and family and stuff like that for like joint things. So if you have kind of like a jerry-rig solution, like syncing things like that, those passwords would get out of sync really fast in a system like that. So you need to have some technology that does its magic on that also.
Nice, yeah. And then a couple questions here. I guess this also applies to Keet. Is Keet audited? And do you guys do consistent audits, or is it just a one-time thing?
So Keet is audited actually indirectly through this PairPass one, because like I said, like literally 99% of the code is the same, right? So that's obviously stuff we're
So you're
missing.
auditing the stack, not the individual product.
And PairPass also, we also audited the product, but we explicitly went in and said, hey, we want to do an audit where we get into the mindset of like doing it on the full stack, because we want this to actually learn also. And we said very explicitly when we did it, like we want to know the issues. Like we're not trying to just get a stamp. We actually want to see if there's any issues. Luckily, it went really well, so like that's good. But even if there was something been flagged, that would have been success also, because we're just trying to build like the most secure product out here. Yeah, we want to do more ongoing reviews as we build things out. As anybody who's done intense deep tech will tell you, like doing an audit too early will be counterproductive, because then like the next week you're like, well, all that is gone now, and like here's the new version. So we had to get to a sense of like this is very stable now, and we can do it. And that's something we've reached in the last couple of years. So it's been very, very good for us, but definitely 100%.
Great. And then I just wanted to verify, you guys are also on Linux on both of those?
We are on painfully many ones. So we are on most of the Linuxes, like the various distros, which as anybody who's working with Linux can tell you, sometimes it gets a little intense. But yeah.
I mean, I actually get very frustrated by it, and I wish the Linux community would have some simpler way to manage this, because I can't even be mad. I am mad, for the record. So I am mad, but I can't very easily publicly be mad at companies, organizations, I suppose, like Signal, because Signal just publishes a DEB. That's it.
Yeah, I was going to say that's also the same thing to do.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, there's this unofficial community Flatpak for an end-to-end encrypted messenger. Like, okay, I know it's safe, it's been there for a long time, but I'm not gonna use that. Like, that's just like I care a lot about where my software comes from. I like to verify like the hashes of where things come from, and so I'm not going to trust just some unofficial community Flatpak. So it is a problem, and I'm glad that you guys are doing more than one thing, even though it's probably a pain in the ass.
So it's interesting you say that, because we try to solve this not by making another app store on Linux, because then they would have 4 app stores or whatever. But we have, so when you make like a pair app, which is what we call the peer-to-peer apps, that's why everything is called something with pair. Like I said, it's using 90% of this, between 90 and 99% of the same code always. And we have now like tooling that targets all these different app stores and stuff. So that's how we distribute Keet. It's just like, it's a general pair app, and then we have a thing that produces whatever it needs to be in the Snap Store and the app and an app image, which is the old way, and a Flatpak that I don't know if we publish it, but we're going to publish, and stuff like that. But like any kind of app built on the platform can do that, because an app in a peer-to-peer network is actually just a cryptographic identifier of the app, and then the rest is pulled in by the network. So if you're building and targeting things like that, it actually can be really cool to do it peer-to-peer, because you get a lot of stuff for free. It's almost like how when you make a website, you don't really have to think so much about browsers, because you just know they exist, and if you just have the link, it works. That's kind of like how we're trying to do it for peer-to-peer app development, but it's also for like native apps and stuff like that.
Kind of zooming back out a little bit and bringing everything together. So I had a couple questions come up as we were going. So what are your thoughts on just companies in general who use P2P, but in a kind of hybrid, still centralized way? So various examples, you did mention games earlier, but I still see it to this day, how some Steam games will use peer-to-peer for app updates. And actually, sometimes that can cause issues for people, and they have to do things on their router, and I'm sure that's a mess there. But also even messengers, WhatsApp, still has P2P for some calls, and also Telegram does this, Signal does this. A lot of these companies kind of pick and choose where to use P2P technology. Do you see still an issue with that? Do you think it's still good that they're embracing P2P in different places, or do you think a pure P2P approach is kind of the only way forward?
So I don't think there's like a way to like use peer-to-peer strictly wrongly. Like it's a set of tools that you can kind of like pick and choose. I think the way I would describe most the way you said there, to some degree at least, vast majority of them, is that it's cost optimization games. So like the reason why a lot of people do calls peer-to-peer is because it's just very, very bandwidth heavy to do a call. So like if you just put a dollar amount on what recording this podcast costs in terms of like bandwidth, it would be something that's like, not bankrupt us, but it would be something where we're like, oh, that's interesting. So there's some things where you just like realistically have to try and do it, and that's why a lot of people do it with calls and stuff like that. The flip side of that is, I think, is that when you go extreme with it, that's where the interesting things happen. It's kind of like when you don't just do it for cost optimization, but also start doing it into like this unregulated, in a good way, fusion of an app that can do all kinds of things that is like truly unscalable and unstoppable. Then you start to think about this like cost optimization way in a whole different way. Like I kind of said before, where like, well, if nothing costs anything, because everything is distributed, you can also think about products in different ways, because you can add interesting things like, why is, a lot of services when I upload a file, it will be like, well, it has to be 30 megabytes, and everybody kind of just accepts that it's 30 megabytes. And when I email something that's too big, my email will say, you can't do that. And often you can even pay for it, and it will be like, you still can't do that. And that's just kind of like this Stockholm syndrome we all have with centralization, where we can't just say, oh, yeah, that's true. And I guarantee you, I could even ask my parents, they would say, well, that's just how it is. Because we're not thinking about this technology in like this unhinged way, which we need to do. So once you start to go down the road, I think just much more interesting things start to happen, and you just think about products in a whole different way. And you also think about products in a way that's a bit more scary for companies, I think, to some degree, because it's where you quickly optimize yourself out of the equation, which is why a lot of people don't do it. Because like, if everything is distributed and peer-to-peer, then why do you exist? Because the app can just, like I said, keep existing if you go bankrupt. So yeah, but I don't think there's a wrong way of doing it. I do think a lot of the stuff that, kind of like messing around with your router and stuff is just because it's kind of like tacked on and not thought into like as a pure thing. That's kind of like where the technology starts to bubble up to the user. That's not so good. And there's like plenty of ways, if you do like peer-to-peer right, where you can avoid that. But yeah, for sure.
Are there any downsides, especially, when I think about in the context of Signal, one of the criticisms of Signal is, and Telegram and WhatsApp, they all do the same thing. By default, they do opt you in to this peer-to-peer aspect, which also means that you are exposing your IP address to the other person when you're doing a phone call. And so if this is something anyone's concerned about, you can just go into your Signal account and just toggle it on to always proxy it through the server. But my assumption is you can't do that with something like Keet, or do you now have to use other P2P technologies like Tor and other things to protect people's IP address?
Yeah, P2P networks obviously inherently mean that we're connecting to each other, so we can in some of those cases see each other's addresses and stuff, also some others. But I think it's one of those things where there's plenty of tools out there that are pretty good, that layer pretty well, like including VPNs, which are a good way, if you're very concerned about that, to or even just normally concerned, to limit your exposure to anything. I would say this is what I tell people also, like, or what I tell my parents, is like, if that's something where, in the context of how you're using the apps and products, it's something you should be thinking about in general, not like pick and choose your features. So I think that's a little bit dangerous. So basically, if you're generally concerned about that, always use a VPN, because you're going to have IP exposure in the ways that you can't even imagine. And it's kind of like, it doesn't take a lot, like tracking pixels, whatever, and things like that. So in general, it's a good idea to be thinking about these things online, and it's like there's plenty of scalable things. We actually have a side project. We're also working on a little peer-to-peer VPN for these same reasons, because it's also a cool way to do it. The opposite side of that is, like, in a peer-to-peer network, you have much more control. So you can kind of like, for example, when we talked about pair pass and stuff like that, a network where you're sharing with yourself, I would never think about it personally, because it's kind of like I'm just talking to myself. It doesn't matter. And like chat rooms with my family and stuff like that, I also don't care. And also me as a, right now you can kind of see my office and stuff, and we talked about where I am. It's also like different kind of concerns. So you kind of like, you need to use your brain a little bit, but in general, there's plenty of really good tools out there like VPNs to ensure just that this is solved for everything you do online, which you should be thinking about. It's kind of like a consequence of how the protocols of the internet work, I guess.
Yeah, so if two people are using Keet, by default, they can see each other's IP address. And then if they're concerned about that, then use a VPN, use Tor, proxies.
Sorry. Yeah, I didn't mean not to say that. Yeah, so basically.
No, I didn't really ask that. So
in a room, the people you're talking to in a room could probably see your address if they knew what they were doing. There were also plenty of ways in P2P networks where they don't have to do that, because actually in a P2P network, you don't have to connect directly. You can do stuff where you route traffic through other people, so you can build these crazy protocols that you want.
That's pretty cool.
So you have all the options, but like again, it's good to think about it in that way. And there's definitely always a chance, depending on how the technology is put together. So yeah.
Got it. A very random question that came to me as we were talking is Apple's FINDMY network, which uses Bluetooth between devices, technically P2P, or is that mesh? Is mesh different from P2P, or am I?
So my definition of peer-to-peer is pretty broad, because I think peer-to-peer to some degree is kind of like saying you, instead of relying on where data lives at a destination point of view, it's kind of like, when I go to google.com, I'm putting in the destination, like the address of google.com, and it's implying that I'm going to Google's server and doing something. So that's not peer-to-peer for me. But as soon as you take that coupling out of the equation and say it's not about where it is, it's about what it can prove, then things start to become peer-to-peer for me, because then the rest, by definition, kind of comes from there, like direct connection and stuff like that, or even not, because it doesn't matter. So I don't know if Apple put on a bunch of specs on how that actually works, but so it's actually hard to answer.
The TLDR, as far as I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but essentially any person with an iPhone that has Bluetooth on, their device is opted into this network,
so they mesh
and
it
that's
down.
how AirTags work, because AirTags don't have GPS chips on them, and all they have is a battery, and it essentially is always pinging to see if it can find a phone, and then that essentially functions as a way to track that device.
I would imagine that Apple does a bunch of cryptography things on that to try to make that private. That's generally what they try to do.
It's somewhat privacy respecting.
Yeah.
Somewhat.
So that's definitely a mesh network, and I would also say, per my definition, that's some variation of a P2P network in that sense, where like that's probably just a proof that it came from that device, not where the device is address-wise. So that's interesting. I think it's also just worth noting on that, like per the same definition, you can also build not a centralized systems, but you can build systems in the P2P world where there is like a service running somewhere that you contact, as long as you just contact that through some way where the service describes, this is my data, or like this is my authentication versus like my address. So you can build all kinds of cool things with that. But yeah, that sounds within the target, I think.
Yeah, and I might have gotten some details wrong. So if somebody wants to correct me, please do. I wanted to ask about environmental differences, because there's a lot of talk about centralized servers, especially now with AI, and I'm seeing a lot more headlines and news coverage that, even though we were finally moving in a renewable direction, and we were saying, well, yeah, renewables are great, we're starting to see coal uptick again because of a lot of the heavy demand that we're seeing for things like AI and these data servers. So what's the environmental footprint difference, if any, with a peer-to-peer network? Since it's distributed across many people, I guess I could see it going either way. If it's distributed equally across many people, maybe then it's lower energy usage, but maybe having it centralized where things can be hyper-optimized is also better. So do you know about this? Is this something that has been studied at all?
I'm sure there is studies around the actual details of it. I can't remember the exact things. I recently, it's actually funny because just before this call, somebody sent me an article about how much compute on average, like an AI generated image burns today, and like put it in context of like kilometers traveled in a car. And this I mean, I knew it was energy consuming, but it's surprisingly eye-opening. Yes, definitely stuff to do there for whoever's working on that. P2P networks, it's like, by design, cutting out the middleman, pretty optimal, because like you can build networks where, especially in these kind of environments, like a chat, where a lot of chat at the end of the day is very physically correlated also, right? It's kind of like you chat a lot with your family. Your family tends to be in the same places. Cities have networks also, like your friends are usually in the same cities. And then obviously there's these exceptions where you do these long random jumps everywhere, but like things tend to be very clustered. So just kind of like in terms of compute needs to be burned, and that network is very, very efficient because, again, we have the devices already, and the device is already running. And it's like, I've had people, especially in the early days of peer-to-peer, ask me concerns about like, well, if it's encrypted, then, we need to run the encryption on the device, and that sounds expensive in terms of energy and stuff. But then when you're talking to servers today anyway, it's also in-flight encrypted because that's kind of like where the world moves. So we're doing that anyway. So it's actually the cost today is really, really small, as in like comparable on the transport, but then we don't have to transport both not very far and also like not a lot because we try to be efficient. So it can be built incredibly energy efficient, which is really, really important. Now, totally consider, I actually don't know the data on that. Like there are some things that are obviously when you do it like big scale can be better, but it tends to be more big compute things. But like also, like I said, you can also build variations of peer-to-peer networks where you have services that do more. So I think in general, you can just build peer-to-peer networks in a way that can be extremely energy efficient in a way where you just can't do it with centralized solutions, just because the implication of the centralized solution means that the stuff has to travel back and forth, and you need to have both the end devices and the big things and stuff like that. Whereas peer-to-peer just gives you more options. But again, you can do variations of that, but you can definitely make it very, very energy efficient, because otherwise we couldn't do it on device. So super, super interesting. But I think it's also worth thinking about, and we didn't really talk about that, but also just in this context of like energy efficiency and data traveling. Even more than that also, it's kind of like when things break, like cables break, or like, there's a natural disaster somewhere, or, the power goes out. You really want these things to still work, right? And so it's kind of like peer-to-peer is the only way for that, because otherwise this weakness that also makes it very centralized just stops things really fast. And there's been countless examples of that recently. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it seems like it just democratizes energy and accessibility a little bit more than a traditional system.
Yeah, we have tons of batteries already on our devices, and like, if you ever looked at how much, it's actually a very interesting metric, because I remember I drive an electric car, and at one time I was charging, and I was kind of thinking like, I wonder, just from a naive thought, like how much power does my phone use compared to my car? And then when you looked it up, you're like, holy moly, like your car is just like a bajillion times less a lot efficient, but like consuming. So like running our chat app distributed is just so much more efficient than doing anything else in the world. So like, yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I guess a final question. So when Elon Musk goes on Twitter and says, hey, go download Signal goes down for hours because of the overwhelming number of people. So if that were to happen to something like Keet, I assume, would the inverse happen, or would it just be stable? Like, does the network get stronger when more people join, or is it just...
So I mean, it's like short answer is yes. It's like I said, we just recently had a big influx of users. It's been very interesting to see, because like the things that were actually the hardest with like having a big influx was just like we had some public rooms that started being very, very active. So just kind of like the app was working, but the chat was running really fast. So it's kind of like it was not very useful to be in that room. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like there's a lot of these UX things we tend to forget sometimes that we're working really hard on. But in general, yeah, it's like the network scales up as more people join, and I tend to sleep pretty well at night thinking that, because that makes my life a little bit easier. It also makes it a little bit harder because it never goes down, so it's very few breaks when you're like trying to do stuff. But yeah, that's a feature, I guess.
Yeah, and so if people want to check out what you guys are doing and try it out for themselves, or at least look into the code or something like this, where can they find you guys?
So we have a website, like I said, our only website, two websites. Sorry, we have Keet.io, which is our chat app, where you can go check out the chat app. We have a bunch of very active development rooms on there also. That's linked when you start the app, so it gives you a suggestion to join these public rooms. We have a lot of developers hanging in those and helping people building things, and just people sharing all kinds of crazy things. It's really fun. So Keet.io for that. There you'll download the app. So you only go to the website to get the app, and then you'll be in the peer-to-peer network after that. And then we have pairs.com, like the fruit, which is where we have our general development documentation for our runtime. And also we have a link there to PairPass. And the link for that is pairpass.pairs.com, or is it pass.pairs.com? I can't remember. But it's linked from there, and go check that out. It's super cool. And like I said, I'm on Keet 24/7. That's the problem with the peer-to-peer app, because it never shuts down, because it never goes down. So you can also ask me all the questions on there. I'm very active on there as well.
Very cool. All right, well, I'll leave links down below, and I want to thank you for your time. And it's been very interesting. I don't think I've had anyone who's talked about peer-to-peer tech on the podcast yet, so thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And that is the interview. I want to thank Mathias for taking the time to explain a little bit more about his life, but also the services he's working on, as well as what things probably look like for other messengers out there as well. I want to thank you all for listening and empowering yourself by learning more about the services you use and how they work so that you can make better decisions for your digital freedom. I also wanted to ask for your support in making these podcasts happen. These podcasts are currently unsponsored. We don't really have a real revenue model for them outside of ad revenue. And so if you like what we're doing and want to see it grow and continue to expand, you can do that by supporting Techlore. We have free ways to support us down in the description, as well as paid ways via becoming a Techlorian. Becoming a Techlorian comes with really cool access to certain perks that we've developed for all of you, and you get to support our mission in the process. So check that all out down in the description, and I'll see you all next time on Techlore.